Truth and fiction, they're the hardest to separate.
The events of that day were to lead to the discovery of one of the most bizarre crimes in the annals of American history. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
You're an absolute gem. Thank you for clicking on my Suspect series. I'm Brooke Makenna, but this is one of my 16 days of Halloween where I'm going to be posting every other day this month. Today we are going to be talking about the true story of a horror movie, and horror movies are some of my absolute favorites, and normally I'm the type of girl that doesn't get scared. I can just, watch them and not even like jump half the time. I just absolutely love them and the twists and the turns, but Texas Chainsaw Massacre is one that the brutality, the gore has always just completely creeped me out and leaves me with such like a nauseous feeling at the end. And it's so odd because not many other scary movies can do that. Most of the time I find them quite comical, but those just, they know how to do horror and to make them very, very scary. And if you've never seen them, there's basically a series of 9 movies within the Texas Chainsaw Massacre series so far, and they're about a family of cannibals and the people who fall victim to them. So yeah, it's a bit disturbing. And the worst part of it all is it's always been marketed as a true story. And it was said that this was because they wanted to attract a wider audience. But was that really it? Was that all? By the way, if you are liking me posting so much content like this, please share my channel, get it out there with anybody you think would enjoy it. Please subscribe, thumbs up, and leave some comments down below. I would love to talk to you down there too. But now let's get back to the story. This is one of the most gruesome cases I have ever looked into. I'm not going to make it too gory for you, but there are some details in there to get the full picture that I'm going to have to say. So if you have a weak stomach or you just don't think you can mentally handle it today, come back another time or just skip this video and look out for when I'm posting in 2 days. Now in the movies, the main being, as you could call it, is called Leatherface, and he is the one that basically finds the victims, uses a chainsaw to kill them, and then butchers them like meat because he used to work at a meat factory. So he then turned to humans and did the same thing to them. And after they chop them up, they turn the bones into decorations in their house. They use the meat as food, and Leatherface, this main character, then takes their faces and wears them as a mask. Leatherface's own face is never shown, but in the first movie he has 3 made of victims that he wears. He wears the killing mask, the old lady mask, and the pretty woman mask. And it's said that whatever mask he is wearing shows his personality at the time, how he is feeling, so his family can kind of know what kind of mood he is in, because underneath that mask there is 0 personality. It's pure monster. And it's said that's also because he has a facial deformity underneath those masks that he's always been ashamed of. Leatherface's story has been told since 1974 to present time with different variations and different characters, but they all have the basic storyline of one real killer, one that exists in our world, or one that did. That's right, Leatherface isn't entirely fictional, although the movie plots are. You see, Leatherface was based on a real man born August 27th of 1906 named Edward Theodore Gein. He was born in La Crosse County, Wisconsin, to his parents, George and Augusta, who already had a son 5 years earlier named Henry. They all lived on a 155-acre isolated farm in Plainsfield, Wisconsin, and they all moved there in 1914 after George, who was an alcoholic running a local grocery store, shut it down and sold the business after Augusta told him that he needed to so they could move to an isolated area and get away from people altogether. It was a quiet town of only about 700 people, and the boys only ever left the farm to go to school. Other than that, they went back to the farm, they did household chores, and they listened to their mother preach about her beliefs. She was very religious, and she believed that all women, except for herself, were instruments of the devil and natural prostitutes. And this is something she taught her sons from a very young age. While going to school, Edward's classmates said that he was shy and strange and often laughed at himself. But at 14, he actually dropped out of school to go work at the farm and help out with his family chores. And they stayed together, the whole family, at that farm, far past any years that he would have been at school. And when Edward was 34 and his brother Henry was 39, their father passed away that year. It was April 1st of 1940, and due to alcoholism, he had heart failure and passed away. So the brothers picked up odd jobs to help out, make some money, and they were both handymen, but Edward often also babysat the children of the town because the mothers didn't see that same strange behavior as in school. It was like he grew out of it, and he was perfectly fine with their children. He often even said that he related more to the children than the adults in the town, so he loved babysitting them. But while working together, Henry and Edward, their bosses often said that they kind of bickered and talked about their mother. Henry would say horrible things about their mother, saying that he didn't like the way she lived, he didn't want to live under her rules, and just horrible things about her, where Edward would become angry and shocked and did not like the fact that Henry was speaking ill of their mother. There was obvious tension between the two until May 16th of 1944. They were both out at the farm manning a brush fire when it got out of hand, and police and the fire department actually saw the fire and had to show up and kind of help them tame it back down. While they were there, it was getting dark out, they were containing the fire, and finally they got it all put out and they decided to go back to the fire department, obviously. But then a little while later, Edward actually called the police saying that his brother Henry was missing. Police came back out and they began a search for the property, where they found Henry face down on the ground, dead. There was ash on him, but he was nowhere near where the fire had been. And there were also said to be bruises on his head. The odd part is that Edward said he had no idea where Henry was, but when the police got there, he led them right to him. They believed it was heart failure at first, and then after looking into it a little more, they thought it was asphyxiation by the fire and the smoke, and that's what they listed as his cause of death, even though an autopsy was never done and an investigation was never opened. Although the police did believe that Edward had killed his brother. It was just Edward and his mother now, and Edward took care of his mother 24/7 until she had a stroke herself. She lived through that first stroke, but then shortly after had another. This was brought on because they had gone to a house to buy some straw from a man named Smith. And when they got there, the man named Smith was beating his dog. And a woman came out of the house to yell at him to tell him to stop hurting the dog, but Smith did not, and he beat the dog to death. After this, Augusta was completely horrified by the whole thing, but not just because the dog had died, because the woman was there telling Smith what to do, and she was not married to him and had no say in what he did, and she was angry that she was trying to. But like I said before, she had a very strong hatred for women. She even called this woman Smith's harlot. She died on December 29th, 1945, and after this, Edward kind of just spiraled. At her funeral, he acted like a little boy that was throwing a tantrum, and 38-year-old Edward then took his sadness and his anger and took it to renovating the farmhouse. He boarded up any room that his mother had ever lived in, and he secluded himself to one room off of the kitchen. Over the years, Edward lived in isolation, and he lived off of the farm subsidy that was coming in, as well as being a handyman and often working on the road with the other people in town. He was known around as Weird Old Eddie because he was just kind of a weird soul. But he was harmless. They all just believed he was harmless, except for some of the women who would bring the handyman lunch, and often said when he looked at them, they just felt a odd chill, like it just completely creeped them out. He also, for money, sold a piece of land, but only the land that his brother had owned. And he began to act on his morbid fascination that he has always had with the female body. He began studying textbooks of female anatomy. He was studying experiments done at the Nazi concentration camps, and then he began grave robbing at local cemeteries. He would dig up recently buried female corpses that were around the same age as his mother. Nobody guessed that it was him doing it, and nobody would have guessed what he was doing with them. That is until November 16th of 1957 at Plainfield Hardware Store. Now this was around deer season. It was starting out deer season, and although the store was normally always open, it was closed that day, and nobody really thought much of it at first, thinking possibly it was closed down because they knew all the men were going to be out of town for deer season. But then as it grew later in the day, they realized that it would be odd for the owner not to open the store in such a small town all day long and miss out on any possible money. So they got a little concerned and sent the deputy sheriff, which happened to be the owner's son, into the store to check. He walked in, saw the cash register open and bloodstains on the floor, and his mother, Bernice Warden, was missing. Then a tip was called in saying that the hardware store's truck was actually driven out the rear at 9:30 that morning. The deputy sheriff and Bernice's son said that the last person that he knew of in the store was the evening before her disappearance, a man who was in to buy antifreeze. It was Weird Old Eddie, Ed Gein, and that he said that he would be back the next morning to buy the antifreeze. He was only there to ask about the price that evening. And when the police checked, they found that the last receipt printed was for antifreeze. So that same evening, the police headed out to find Ed and basically question him about the whole thing. They found him at the West Plainfield grocery store. They arrested him right there, and then they headed to his farm. But no amount of preparation could prepare them for what they were about to walk into. Edward Gein's home had no electricity, no heat, so they had to walk into pure darkness in the middle of the night with flashlights. There was garbage everywhere, the smell was horrendous, and at first they just thought that he was a hoarder that was completely messy, disgusting, living in his own filth. And then they realized that his home was basically a museum of body parts. The fridge was filled with human organs. There were bones everywhere, whole and fragmented. Skulls were made into utensils and bowls and also impaled on the bedposts on his bed. Skin, human skin, was used as fabric on chairs, as a wastebasket, and leggings. A belt was made of nipples. Lips were used as a drawstring. A corset was made of the female torso. A lampshade was made of human faces, and masks were made of faces as well. 9 to 15 different women were thought to be inside of Ed's house, but Bernice wasn't one of them. 50-year-old Bernice Warden was found decapitated in the shed, naked, hung upside down by a meat hook. There was a crossbar at her ankles and ropes on her wrists, but her head and her intestines were in a box nearby. She had been gutted like a deer, in their words, and her heart was in a plastic bag hanging near the stove. She'd been shot first and mutilated after. Another woman was found to be in about the same condition as Bernice, and it was 54-year-old Mary Hogan. They identified her by the mask of her face that they found in a paper bag, and her skull was found in a box as well. She had been missing since 1954, 3 years prior. She was the owner of a tavern in the town, and she was known as Bloody Mary because she cursed and she had quite the personality. And when she first went missing, they actually were asking around to anybody who knew where she was or could know, and Edward said, "Oh, I know where she is. She's down by my house." But everybody just laughed it off and thought he was joking. A few days after their initial search, they found human skeletal remains again, which they thought was a man at first because of the big stature, but it was actually of a woman. So another woman's body was found. Although it was a horrifying experience, at least they had evidence for Bernice and for Mary and for many others. When they first began questioning Ed, he refused to speak for 30 hours until they confronted him with Bernice's corpse, and then he pretty much just started talking. He said all he wanted was a slice of apple pie with cheddar cheese sprinkled on top and after he finished eating it, he told them everything they wanted to know. He said that he did kill Mary and Bernice, took them to the farmhouse and gutted them. And between the years of 1947, 2 years after his mother died, and 1952, he was grave robbing. He said he had made over 40 nighttime visits to local cemeteries, but he was always in a daze-like state, and sometimes he would come out of that daze-like state and leave the graves empty-handed, like he came back into himself, into a sane, stable mind. But at least 9 of those times he didn't come out of the daze, and he took the bodies with him. He even led investigators to 9 of those grave sites where he had taken the bodies, and it was found that they were the ones that had just recently been buried. He would go after the ones who were just buried. That way the graves were not always done, and so it was easier for him to get them. But he wasn't remorseful of what he had done, and when he talked about it, he just said it matter-of-factly, and it almost sounded cheerful. Then he revealed why he did it. He said he was creating a woman's suit so he could crawl into the skin and become like his mother. He said he liked to dress as women in general, and that he would often put on a skirt made of human skin and put women's genitalia over his own. It was thought that that was also why he chose Mary as one of his first kills, was because she cursed, she was aggressive, she reminded him of his mother. They had a confession from Mary, Bernice, and the other bodies that were stolen from their graves, but after questioning, a sheriff named Art Shelley actually banged his head several times against a brick wall out of anger and disgust, and so the confession was inadmissible in court. That same sheriff died a year before Ed went to trial, and one of his friends said that he was just as much a victim as one of the people that he had butchered, because he ruined his life after seeing the horrific nature of those crimes and what was in that house. The first court hearings was just to see what kind of psychological testing he needed, and when he was sentenced to having a month-long psychological evaluation, he screamed over and over, "What are they going to do to me?" as if he didn't realize what he had done. Even the public was horrified. They were making jokes. The children were laughing about it. They were calling themselves Geiners, and it was almost like they were masking their horror with humor, which people often do, but they were saying, like, what's Ed's favorite dessert? Ladyfingers. And people from out of town were wanting to come in and wanting to look at the house and see what was inside. Then on November 21st, 1957, he went to court and he pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. After he was diagnosed with schizophrenia, he was then said to be unfit for trial and sent to a mental institute. It was a Central State Hospital for the criminally insane, and it was maximum security. A year after that, his house was set on fire, and most believed it was arson by the people of the community because people from out of town wanted it to become a tourist attraction, but the people of the town wanted nothing to do with it. They wanted to forget what had happened. 10 years later, with Ed being in the mental institute for the entire time, doctors finally said he was mentally up for trial. So he walked in the room, he stopped and he looked at what he believed was his audience, and he bowed his head as if they had all come for him. It only lasted a week, and he was found guilty by just the judge on November 14th of 1968. This was after a psychiatrist of his testified that he had told her he didn't know whether the killing of Bernice was accidental or on purpose. He said he was looking at a gun in the hardware store, and he was trying to load it, and it accidentally shot her, and he didn't mean to, but he didn't remember what happened after that. And the second trial was to declare his sanity, whether he was or not, and he was sentenced to maximum security mental institutes for life. And that is when the butcher of Plainfield finally got his sentence. 16 years later, still in the mental institute, he died on July 26th of 1984. He was 77 years old, and he died of respiratory failure because of lung cancer. And although all of his belongings were basically ruined in that fire, his car that was a 1949 Ford sedan still made it through the fire and was actually auctioned off for $760 to a carnival worker, who then turned it into basically like a ride, an attraction, and charged 25 cents for people to go and see it. Some believed that Ed had originally turned to killing after his buddy who was helping him with the grave robbing, named Gus, actually got too old and was sent to a home for the elderly and could no longer help him, so he had to find other means to get a body. But I don't think this Gus guy has ever been found and has definitely never been connected to this case whatsoever. They also believed for a while that he was connected to some other disappearances. There was a girl who went missing May 1st of 1947 in Jefferson, Wisconsin. She was 8-year-old Georgia Weckler, who went missing on her way home from school. There was also 15-year-old Evelyn Hartley, who was babysitting, and when her father couldn't get a hold of her at the home, he went over there and found that through the window he could see one shoe of hers and glasses on the ground. All of the doors were locked except for the back basement window. There was blood on the window, there was blood through the grass as though she's been drugged, and there was a handprint of blood on the house next door. She was never found either. And then 2 hunters who had been in Plainsfield at a bar then went to hunt deer and were never seen again. It was November of 1952, and their names were Victor, Travis, and Ray Burgess. They all vanished around the same times that Ed would have been doing all of this, but they were not found on his property. Nurses at the mental hospital where he lived said that he was a model patient, that he did occupational therapy, rug making, he liked using radio hams, stone polishing, and if all patients were like him, they'd have no trouble at all. Except for some of the female nurses saying that there was a very strange discomfort that they felt when he stared at them. And some of the patients said during a full moon would be the only time that he would really talk to them, and he would only talk about women and his hatred for them and what he would do to them. The community of Plainfield after that was just horrified. They locked their doors when they hadn't before, they didn't go out much, it changed them forever. And Ed's grave has actually been vandalized so much that they had to remove the grave marker, and I just think that is what a grave robber should get. One of the creepiest revelations that I found while doing my research was that one of the kids that Ed babysat, like I said that he babysat before, actually had gone to his farm one day and found what Ed was showing him to be shrunken heads that were supposedly overseas. A cousin had sent him from World War II. And when this kid told his, friends and family about these shrunken heads that Ed had, they all just kind of laughed at him and said, okay, stop being silly, like you're making that up, when he knew he wasn't. And years later, when the police searched his home, they found that those shrunken heads were skins of corpses' faces all put together. So I hope you can kind of see the similarities between Texas Chainsaw Massacre and this creepy serial killer. It's not exact, and Texas Chainsaw Massacre is obviously fiction with the whole story, but there are definitely some connections there. But that wasn't the only horror movie inspired by this sick individual. In 1960, a movie called Psycho came out. It was about Norman Bates and his mother, who owned a motel and was thought to be a killer. Except Norman's mother had died 10 years prior, and he had been keeping her mummified corpse in the upstairs attic. He had also been dressing as her the entire time and calling himself Mother, and it seems like that is where Ed possibly would have been headed. And in 1991, The Silence of the Lambs came out, and Buffalo Bill was based on Ed, or at least thought to be, because he was a serial killer who skinned female victims and then dressed himself in it. But overall, this true crime case is a horror movie in itself, and I hope I didn't terrify you or sicken you too much. But were you expecting that? Did you know that it was a true story? Do you have any other serial killers that you think that these horror films are based on? And if you have any other favorite horror movies or horror movies that you know of that have true stories behind them, please leave them down below so I have something to watch this Halloween. And yeah, this was an absolute disgusting one, and I'm so sorry if it made any of you guys as nauseous, because it's one of those cases that when I was researching actually got to me really bad, and not just in like a oh I'm sad sense, but in a I might barf. Whew, so yeah, kind of a dark one, but kind of creepy, and please, you might want to go watch a happy one after this, like a Disney movie or something. I don't know, don't go to sleep right after watching this. But no matter what, don't forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye.
Maybe deep down we all don't want to admit that evil really does exist.